Welcome to War Bios, where we delve into the intricacies of military history's most pivotal battles. Today, we're going to explore one of the most intense and decisive conflicts of World War II, the Battle of the Seelow Heights. This brutal and bloody confrontation marked a crucial turning point in the war on the Eastern Front, as Soviet forces clashed with the German Wehrmacht in a desperate bid for control of the approach to Berlin. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were closing in on Germany from all sides. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, had been pushing deep into Eastern Europe, driven by a desire to claim Berlin and bring a swift end to the war. The German High Command, however, was determined to defend their capital at all costs. The city was a symbol of Nazi power, and its capture would be a devastating blow to the morale of the German people. In the months leading up to the battle, the Soviet forces had been making steady gains, pushing the Germans back through Poland and into eastern Germany. The First Belarusian Front, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had been tasked with capturing Berlin, and they were determined to do so as quickly as possible. Zhukov's forces were a formidable opponent, comprising over 1 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces. The Soviet army was a well-oiled machine with a proven track record of success on the Eastern Front. As the Soviet army advanced, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance from the German Wehrmacht. The Germans had established a strong defensive line along the Oder River, which marked the border between Germany and Poland. This line was anchored by the Seelow Heights, a range of hills that dominated the surrounding countryside and offered a clear view of the approaching Soviet forces. The Germans had carefully prepared their defenses, deploying their troops in a series of layered positions designed to slow down the Soviet advance. The German commander, General Gotthard Heinrici, was a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front. He had a reputation for being one of the most skilled and resourceful commanders in the German army, and he was determined to make the Soviets pay dearly for every inch of ground they gained. Heinrici's defensive strategy was centered around the Seelow Heights, which he knew would be the key to holding back the Soviet tide. In the weeks leading up to the battle, the Soviets had been gathering intelligence on the German defenses, using reconnaissance patrols and aerial photography to identify weak points in the line. Zhukov's staff had also been studying the terrain, looking for opportunities to outflank the Germans and catch them off guard. The Soviet commanders were well aware of the challenges they faced, but they were confident in their ability to break through the German defenses. As the Soviet forces prepared to launch their assault, they were aware of the daunting task that lay ahead. The Seelow Heights were a formidable obstacle, and the German defenses were strong. However, Zhukov was confident in his troops' ability to overcome any obstacle. He had a reputation for being one of the most brilliant and aggressive commanders on the Eastern Front, and he was determined to prove himself once again. On April 14, 1945, the Soviet forces began their final preparations for the assault. The air was thick with tension as soldiers checked their equipment, loaded their guns, and steeled themselves for the battle ahead. As the Soviet troops moved into position, they could feel the weight of history on their shoulders. They were about to embark on a mission that would change the course of the war, and possibly the course of history itself. The Germans, meanwhile, were dug in and waiting, their gun sights fixed on the approaching enemy. The battle was about to begin, and the outcome was far from certain. The Soviet artillery had been positioned, the infantry was in place, and the tanks were ready to roll. The sound of engines roaring to life, the smell of diesel fuel and smoke, and the sight of thousands of soldiers moving into position all combined to create an atmosphere of anticipation and fear. The Soviet commanders knew that the next few hours would be crucial, and they were determined to make the most of them. As the clock struck 5:00 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the Soviet artillery opened fire, unleashing a barrage of shells that shook the very foundations of the earth. The German defenses were pounded mercilessly as the Soviets attempted to blast a hole in the line and create an opening for their infantry and tanks to pour through. The battle had begun, and it would be a fight to the death. As the Soviet artillery barrage raged on, the German defenders huddled in their trenches, awaiting the inevitable infantry assault. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite. At 5:30 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the Soviet infantry emerged from the mist, their rifles at the ready, like specters rising from the earth. The German machine guns opened fire, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. But the Soviets kept coming, their momentum fueled by a mix of patriotism, ideology, and the promise of victory. The fighting was intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Germans had carefully prepared their defenses, with layered positions and interlocking fields of fire, designed to funnel the Soviet attackers into killing zones. However, the Soviets had a significant advantage in numbers and firepower, which they leveraged to wear down the German strongpoints. As the morning wore on, the Soviet infantry began to make gains, slowly but surely pushing the Germans back, inch by bloody inch. One of the most significant events of the battle occurred on April 17, when the Soviet First Guards Tank Army, led by General Mikhail Kutukov, launched a massive armored assault on the German positions. The tanks rolled forward in waves, their cannons blazing as they targeted the German strongpoints, sending shockwaves through the earth and shattering the enemy's resolve. The Germans had few anti-tank guns, and those they did have were largely ineffective against the heavily armored Soviet T-34s, which seemed almost invulnerable to the German defenses. As the Soviet tanks broke through the German lines, the infantry followed close behind, mopping up pockets of resistance and securing key terrain features. The Germans fought fiercely, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, their situation growing more desperate by the hour. By the end of April 17, the Soviets had breached the Seelow Heights, and the German defenses were on the verge of collapse, like a dam about to burst under the pressure of a swollen river. The battle was marked by numerous acts of heroism and sacrifice on both sides, as soldiers on both sides fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. As the Soviets continued to push forward, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance from the German rearguard, who were determined to slow down the Soviet advance, buying time for their comrades to escape and regroup. However, the Soviets were relentless, driving forward with a ferocity that bordered on recklessness, their commanders pushing them to maintain the momentum of the attack. The Germans, meanwhile, were fighting a desperate rearguard action, hoping to delay the inevitable and give their comrades a chance to escape the Soviet juggernaut. By April 18, the battle was all but over. The Germans had been pushed back across the Oder River, and the Seelow Heights were firmly in Soviet hands. The cost had been high, with both sides suffering tens of thousands of casualties, the landscape scarred by the detritus of war, shattered tanks, burning buildings, and the bodies of the dead and wounded. However, the Soviets had achieved their strategic objective, paving the way for the final assault on Berlin, the ultimate prize in the war against Nazi Germany. As the dust settled over the battlefield, the Soviet commanders surveyed the carnage, their faces grim and exhausted, their eyes haunted by the memories of what they had seen. In the words of General Zhukov, the Battle of the Seelow Heights was a victory of wills, a clash of titans that would decide the fate of Europe. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over, and the Soviets knew that their toughest challenge still lay ahead: the capture of Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, and the ultimate symbol of the enemy's power. As the Soviet forces secured their hold on the Seelow Heights, they began to prepare for the final push into Berlin, a city that had become a symbol of Nazi resistance and defiance. The Battle of the Seelow Heights, which had raged from April 16 to 1945, had been a brutal and bloody affair, with estimates suggesting that over 30,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded, while the Soviets suffered around 20,000 casualties. Despite the heavy losses, the Soviet advance continued unabated, driven by the determination to capture the German capital and bring an end to the war. As General Zhukov, the commander of the First Belarusian Front, gazed out upon the scarred landscape, he knew that the battle ahead would be just as fierce. The Germans had fortified their positions within Berlin, using every available building, street, and alleyway to create a labyrinthine defense system. Zhukov's forces would have to fight their way through this maze, house by house, block by block, in order to reach the heart of the city. On April 22, 1945, the Soviet forces launched a massive assault on Berlin, with the First Belarusian Front pushing forward from the east. The battle for Berlin was intense and chaotic, with street fighting and house-to-house combat becoming the norm. The German defenders, a mix of regular army units, SS troops, and Hitler Youth, fought fiercely, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. As the Soviet forces pushed deeper into the city, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance, particularly around key landmarks such as the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. The battle raged on for days, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Soviets, however, had the advantage of superior numbers and firepower, which gradually began to tell. By April 25, 1945, they had encircled the city, cutting off any possible escape routes for the German defenders. As the noose tightened, the Germans became increasingly desperate, launching futile counterattacks in a bid to break through the Soviet lines. As the battle reached its climax, the human cost of war became starkly apparent. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, suffered terribly, with many forced to flee their homes or take shelter in cramped and unsanitary conditions. The streets ran red with blood as the wounded and the dead littered the pavement. The once proud city of Berlin was reduced to a smoldering ruin, its buildings shattered, its people broken. On April 30, 1945, the Soviets finally broke through the German defenses and were closing in on the center of the city. It was on this day that Adolf Hitler, the man who had sparked the war, took his own life, marking the beginning of the Third Reich. As the news spread like wildfire, the German defenders began to lose heart, their morale crumbling beneath the weight of defeat. The Battle of Berlin finally came to an end on May 6, 1945, when the Soviet forces reached the city center and raised the red flag over the Reichstag building. The German garrison, exhausted and outnumbered, surrendered en masse, bringing an end to the fighting. As the dust settled, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The city lay in ruins, its people shattered, its infrastructure destroyed. In the years that followed, the Battle of the Seelow Heights was remembered as a pivotal moment in the war on the Eastern Front. It marked the beginning of the end of Germany's ability to resist the Soviet advance and paved the way for the eventual capture of Berlin. Today, the Battle of the Seelow Heights is remembered as one of the most significant battles of the Second World War. It is commemorated by a museum and memorial complex on the site of the battle, which attracts visitors from all over the world. The battle is also remembered in Russia, where it is seen as a symbol of Soviet bravery and sacrifice. The legacy of the Battle of the Seelow Heights can be seen in the modern-day German-Russian relationship, with both countries continuing to grapple with the consequences of the war. As the German historian Jürgen Gunzenmüller notes, the Battle of the Seelow Heights was a turning point in the war, but it also marked the beginning of a long and complex process of reconciliation between Germany and Russia. The Battle of the Seelow Heights serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of war and the enduring power of human courage and resilience. Remember, the battle may be won, but the war is never truly over. Its legacy lives on, shaping the course of history and informing our understanding of the world today. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography, reminding you to keep marching toward victory.